Hi, everyone. Welcome to Maximizing Treatment Options, What to Know When Considering Clinical Trials, with your moderator, Annie Ellis, and panelists, Eliza Adams, Jessica Safran, Jane, and Karen Durham. My name is Christine Benjamin, and I'm the Breast Cancer Program Director at SHARE. I'm joined today by Savannah Shine, the Ovarian Cancer Program Director. So now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Annie Ellis. Annie Ellis is an 11-year-old survivor of recurrent ovarian cancer and a 5-year survivor of breast cancer. Annie has participated in clinical trials and serves the ovarian cancer community as a research advocate and provides peer support through SHARE's Ovarian Helpline and New York Presbyterian Columbia Woman-to-Woman program. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Christine. I'm so happy to be here and talk about this important topic. Here's the agenda and a few things that we're going to be covering today. I became a clinical trial speaker pretty much by accident. I was a last-minute replacement speaker to provide the patient perspective at the Ovarian Cancer Research Fund Research Symposium a few years ago and was later asked to participate in their clinical trial video. I provide peer support primarily in the ovarian cancer recurrence setting, frequently at decision points, including discussions about clinical trial participation. Although there's an abundance of technical information available on the internet about clinical trials, that's quite a bit to go through on one's own. Our medical teams have limited time to spend with us, and what's often missing is just taking the time to think through the many options we're given and consider all the factors. We are excited to have several clinical trial participants share their stories about their experiences and the things that they considered before participating. And much of what we're going to cover today are the kinds of things that are frequently discussed on decision-making calls and in support group. So we're going to go over a few basics first. Again, there's a lot of information about clinical trials already available, and we will have links on the resource page at the end of this presentation. Basically, clinical trials are just a way to find if new treatments are safe, effective, and better than or equal to the current standard of care. Women with recurrent ovarian cancer and metastatic breast cancer are living longer than ever before with careful management of the available FDA-approved drugs. But not all of those therapies work for everybody. So it's helpful to stay aware of what's going on with clinical trials and emerging medicine. It has been suggested that women with recurrent or metastatic disease consider clinical trials to expand their treatment options, to gain access to novel treatment not available outside of studies. If the drug doesn't work, the approved therapies are still there. And it's important to consider clinical trials sooner rather than later. The more chemo you've had, the fewer trials you can qualify for. And we need to understand that not every clinical trial is right for everybody. We need to consent and we need to have understanding before we can consent to participate. It's important to reach a comfort level before we decide to participate, and this webinar will cover things to think about. One thing to remember is that clinical trials are not designed for individual patient benefit, but to answer questions. And the first question is the new treatment or combination safe, and how much of it? And these questions are usually answered in phase 1 clinical trials, which is usually with a small group of people, and it may be the first time in humans. Researchers are looking at safety, determining a safe dosage range, and identifying side effects. The next question is this new treatment effective? And these are usually answered in phase 2, a larger group of people, to see if it's effective and to further evaluate safety. And then finally, is the new treatment better or equal to the current standard treatment? Again, larger groups of people will confirm its effectiveness, and sometimes there's randomization and sometimes there's blinding, and we will get to that later. And some of the new questions that are being asked are, will some patients benefit more than others? In the past, this was always done through post-trial subset analysis, where they would go back and look at their data after the trial is completed to see if anybody's who responded better than others, or maybe some people didn't respond and why. There are new kinds of trials now using biomarkers to stratify patients. So we're looking at, in ovarian cancer, maybe BRCA status, and in breast cancer, your hormone receptor or HER2 status. Two important trials that are happening in this area at NCI are the Exceptional Responders Initiative and NCI Match. Exceptional Responders is looking for people who, in negative trials, who've responded really well, and they're looking to find out why and maybe find out if somebody else would also respond well. And we have that a link to that information on the resource page. And NCI Match is just using genetic information to put people into trials based on different targets. And again, the resource link is at the end. Clinical trial design is evolving, and we're coming into the age of molecularly informed precision medicine, which is the right drug for the right person at the right time. And there are two different kinds of trials that are different from before. In an umbrella trial, one type of cancer, like ovarian cancer or breast cancer, is accrued, and then people are sorted into different arms depending on their genetic makeup of the cancer. A basket trial would be where it would include people with a bunch of different cancers, but they have the same type of genetic mutation, perhaps, and they're looking to see if that commonality will help us find new drugs for that specific mutation. So let's dispel some common myths about clinical trials. The first myth I always hear is that clinical trials are for a last resort, and that's just not true. There are some clinical trials in first-line treatment to see if the standard of care can be improved, and until there are improved outcomes in first-line treatment, many women will have recurrences. If after a clinical trial we need to move on to something else, the FDA-approved drugs will still be there. Yeah. What's available through clinical trials is constantly changing, and the more treatments someone has had, the fewer trials that are open to that person. Some trials require that you've had no more than 1 or 2 prior lines of therapy, and some eliminate you if you've previously received a drug being used in the trial. The next thing I hear a lot is people don't want to be treated like a guinea pig. I think that one of the things is that I hear over and over again from people who've participated in recent clinical trials is that they are treated very well by their doctors, nurses, and staff. The human aspect is maintained, and they are made to feel safe and comfortable. The reason these new drugs are being brought to humans is that prior tests have been very interesting, and it's got the potential to be the next standard of care. Some testing has been done in animals, but to really know if it's going to work, it needs to be brought into humans. I really like an article that came out in the New York Times over the summer when someone compared it to being a test pilot. Not a lab rat, but a patient who needs treatment and is in control and has decided that previous treatment was not adequate. He considers himself a collaborator. His doctor called him a pioneer, and he thinks of himself as a test pilot, testing out the novel drug, being one of the first to use it. Also, we hear that people are afraid of getting a placebo. In cancer clinical trials, everyone who needs treatment will get treatment. The only time that a placebo is used is if the current standard of care is to watch and wait, like in remission, or if a new treatment is being added to an existing treatment. So some participants will receive the standard therapy plus a novel therapy, and some people will receive a standard therapy plus a placebo. But everyone gets treatment. In cancer clinical trials, everyone who needs treatment will get treatment. And the last thing I hear very frequently is that once you sign up, you can't stop or go back, and that's just false. The participant has the right to withdraw at any time for any reason. And I know people who have withdrawn for many reasons. Some started the protocol but were no longer comfortable with the toxicities. Some completed receiving the novel therapy but wanted to avoid the follow-up scans. And other people withdrew because the schedule just was not convenient. Participants are protected. There's discontinuation if the disease progresses or if the side effects are too adverse. And many trial participants are referred to cancer centers for clinical trials by their home doctors. Some participants even continue to see their doctors during the trial, and most return to their home institution when the trial is over. Although novel therapies are described as exciting, promising, breakthrough, we hear a lot, it's important to remember that it's not known if the study drug is going to work and for how long for any specific person. It's not known what specific side effects, short-term and long-term, will be experienced. And there's no guarantee that the novel drug being studied will be better than the standard drugs. It is an experiment, and it is an investigation to gather data. I know when I participated, one of the things that took me aback was seeing experimental treatment center on the door. So why do we take that risk? Well, for many people dealing with metastatic or recurrent disease, there are no guarantees with the standard drugs either, and there are potential benefits. The first is contribution. Some people participate in clinical trials because they want to be a part of bringing better treatments to the future. Only a small percentage of adults participate in clinical trials. The cure rate for childhood cancer has improved greatly in the last 2 decades, mostly because so many children participate in clinical trials. Access to exciting drugs and treatments not readily available. Many are only available in trials. It can take years or even decades of trials for new drugs to become FDA approved. And access gives us more options, which is important to managing chronic disease long term. More attention and careful, close monitoring, perhaps at a different medical institution with an additional medical team. And more information about a condition that might be difficult to get outside of a trial, like genomic sequencing or another expensive type of testing. But my number one reason for participating in a clinical trial is I might benefit. There are no guarantees, but there are no guarantees with current standard of care either. And many people I speak to, that's their number one motivation is I might benefit. So if you're interested in clinical trials, there is some information to get started. You can read everything out here, which is just copies of your latest test scans and pathology. Right now, BRCA mutation status is very important with some of the novel therapies that work very well in people who are mutation carriers. And also genomic information about the tumor. Sometimes it's readily available based on some tests or biopsies that might have been done before. But if that information is not readily available, it is something to discuss with your medical team. It may open the doors to more trials. So let's talk about some factors that need to be considered. Well, finding a trial can be really frustrating, and it's not really easy. Sometimes your doctor will recommend a trial. There are many clinical trial matching services. A lot of people find ClincalTrials.gov really hard to navigate, and so clinical trial matching services help them through that. Share has partnered with Emerging Med to offer this service. Sometimes you can get a clinical trial through second opinion and word of mouth. Qualifying can be difficult and frustrating. Is it first line or recurrence? You know, how much measurable disease is necessary? Is rising markers enough? As well as how much prior chemotherapy you've had, or if you've had something that's being used in the trial before. And current status. I know it sounds frustrating, but blood counts, kidney and liver function, everything is looked at because they want to make sure that everybody is healthy enough to participate in the trial and not bias the information. Scans and tests. You might need more scans and tests to determine if you're eligible, and extra scans and tests might be required during the trial to monitor if this is effective or not. And then time. The administration of the trial medication can take longer than chemotherapy, and more frequent visits may be required to get the chemotherapy, and also for all those additional tests and scans. Travel. How far are you willing to travel if a specific clinical trial is not offered at your institution? And are transportation and housing assistance provided? This is something very important to ask because sometimes if you don't ask, you don't get. Some places do have funds available to help participants, and someone participating in trials at NCI may be able to have some transportation and housing assistance. And cost, not just the travel costs, but is the drug, is everything involved covered by insurance? And if not, who's paying? A lot of times the novel drug is routinely covered, but sometimes people have had problems with those additional scans and tests. It's something to ask your insurance company and the investigating team so that you know all the facts before you start. And then randomization. Randomization is the way to distribute participants between trial arms. Usually the experimental arm will receive a novel therapy and the control arm will receive the standard of care. Some trials do allow participants to cross over to the experimental arm if disease progression occurs while they are on the control arm. And for some people, that's an important part of participating in a clinical trial. And then blinding. Blinding is to avoid bias. In a blind trial, the participant doesn't know which arm has been assigned, and in double blind, both the participant and the investigator do not know. But a lot of participants have been able to figure out which arm they're in by the side effects that they experience, but that's not always guaranteed. And now, informed consent. Informed consent is not a piece of paper, but it's the process for the participant's protection. Information is provided. It can be written and verbal. It's about the trial to help you make decisions. The purpose is so that the participant understands the protocol and that you voluntarily agree. The consent form itself can be very intimidating. It can be very long. It may not be written in language that's easy to understand, so it's important to take the time to ask questions and have a discussion with your medical team, with the investigating team, with your family, and even with other survivors who may be able to help you have some perspective on what it means to participate. But also, the informed consent process should be ongoing. So as new information arises as the investigation progresses, that should be passed down to the participants. And the consent form can include all this information, which is a lot of the factors that we spoke about earlier. But again, I do want to reiterate that the right to withdraw at any time for any reason is a part of the consent form, and that everyone should know about that. For me, I didn't sign up for a clinical trial with the intention of withdrawing, but knowing that I had the right to do it, to change my mind, really helped me decide that this was the right choice for me. And lastly, it's important to know reporting side effects is an important obligation of clinical trial participants. And just some information, adverse events are what our medical team, we report to our medical team, and the medical team reports that. And patient-reported outcomes are, some trials have ways for the participants to directly report their side effects directly into a database without going through the doctor. And there are many collection tools being worked on, and this is one of them. So we are going to start with our first participant speaker, Jane. Jane is a breast cancer survivor. She was diagnosed in 2011 with high-grade clear cell uterine cancer, and in 2014 experienced a local recurrence of the uterine cancer, which progressed to metastatic disease. And she participated in an early phase immunotherapy clinical trial. Thank you for joining us, Jane.
Thank you for allowing me this opportunity. I've had a very positive experience. I did some research on my own with the help of the American Cancer Society to find out more about this high-grade clear cell serous uterine cancer that I developed about 10 years after surviving breast cancer. And what I discovered that I found helpful was the first-line chemotherapy that I was given in 2011 when I was diagnosed at the end of my surgery and my chemotherapy, there was no detectable disease in my body. Yet in 2014, I had a local reoccurrence. and radiation and chemotherapy were suggestive. And they said since it was localized, it was very curable, no problem. And I did what was suggested, and it didn't work. So they again suggested that I take the same chemotherapy that I had taken in 2011, which didn't really make much sense to me, since I thought that, you know, it didn't work the first time. Why would it work as a cure this time, or in any capacity? So I did my own research, and I found that clear cell tumors were found in kidney cancer, as well as ovarian and high-grade uterine. And I was reading a lot about kidney cancers, and I found that they were especially susceptible to immunotherapy. And I liked the idea of immunotherapy. It just appealed to me. The whole idea of having my own body learn how to fight the cancer was very intellectually appealing. So I asked my doctor to recommend me. There was, you know, a little bit of back and forth on that, and then I was recommended to the immunotherapy department, and I began the treatments. I had tried to go on to the Clinical Trials website, but I was overwhelmed by, you know, the need for so much medical terminology understanding. And I did, in fact, have someone help me who submitted me for 2 trials. But one, they said that I didn't qualify because it was only for ovarian cancer, and I had high-grade uterine. And the other, they said that I was too old. The toxicity level of the trial drug was not recommended for someone of my age. I didn't think I was that old until that moment, but apparently they did. And so I have been, I think I'm about to have my 10th treatment on this immunotherapy that I've been taking. And what I found most helpful was that every time something came up, you know, if I had a symptom of some sort, the team was tremendously diligent about following up. In fact, you know, no matter what was going on, they would make appointments, and they would get appointments for me very, very quickly, because the other departments in the hospital were very happy to help anyone who was in a clinical trial to make sure that either whatever they were treating was because of the drug or was not. And in my case, none of the things that cropped up had anything to do with the drug. But I got exceptional care and very rapid response from all the departments. So I would say that, you know, I had a very good experience. I did get hives. Nobody could figure out what they were from, but I can sometimes get hives if someone looks at me cross-eyed. So I wasn't really sure whether it was the drug or, you know, somebody on the team who looked at me in a way that was too familiar, joking there. They got a colonoscopy for me very quickly when they thought that something might have been wrong in that area. Nothing was. They've just been very helpful and very on top of it. If I need something, I call them. They respond very quickly. Within an hour, I get somebody answering my call. And what I would like to say to whoever is listening is that we all, you know, like if we're diligent about doing our own research, we all look up the results of clinical trials to see what our good percentages are for certain drugs and not for others. And since that's something that we do, just to see if the drug that we're considering is appropriate for us, we're always looking at the results of clinical trials. And I feel a certain responsibility to myself and to everybody else to be part of that process. And it is very much needed. I was speaking to one of the doctors, and he said such a tiny percentage of cancer patients participate in a clinical trial. And it's so vital and so important to advancing our medical health. And so I jumped on board because I thought that, that after doing my own personal research, I thought that this could be beneficial. And that's it. If I can answer any questions, I'll be happy to.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jane. Our next speaker is Jessica Safran. She was diagnosed in May 2011 with stage 3C ovarian cancer and experienced recurrence of the disease in September 2013 and has participated in 1 clinical trial. Jessica considers clinical trial participation at every decision point. Thank you for being with us today, Jessica.
Thank you, Annie. It's great to be here. So I was originally diagnosed, as Annie said, with stage 3C ovarian cancer at the age of 44 in May 2011. I had my first debulking surgery, which was suboptimal. My surgeon left about 5% of the tumor in me. I went through genetic testing and discovered I was positive for the BRCA1 gene mutation. I completed my first line of chemotherapy. After my initial treatment, I was in remission until September 2013 when I had my first recurrence. I participated in a surgical clinical trial. It was a phase 2 study of secondary cytoreduction with and without HIPEC plus postoperative chemotherapy for women with recurrent ovarian, fallopian tube, or primary peritoneal cancer. I learned about the HIPEC trial through the gynec surgeon who was highly recommended to me by other survivors when I had my first recurrence. He was the principal investigator of the HIPEC trial and proposed it for me since I was a good match. HIPEC stands for hypothermic or heated intraperitoneal chemotherapy. All visible tumors are removed during surgery, and then a heated chemo solution is pumped into the abdominal area, creating an internal bath to kill any remaining cancer cells. HIPEC experts say the heat makes the chemotherapy more powerful at killing cancer cells. Now, I have to admit, after researching the process, I was scared of doing the HIPEC and the potential complications that could occur. But since it was a randomized study, there was no guarantee that I'd even receive the treatment. In spite of my fears, I couldn't actually decide if I wanted the treatment or not. So the fact that the study was randomized wasn't such a bad thing. I'd let the computer decide if I got the treatment. I had a second debulking surgery that was considered successful this time, which was also a prerequisite for participating in the clinical trial. If the debulking had been suboptimal, I would have been ineligible. After my surgery, I was randomized not to get HIPEC, but felt okay about that. I knew I'd still be in the clinical trial and followed closely by my surgeon until I recurred. I completed a second line of chemotherapy and then considered going on a clinical trial for a new PARP inhibitor. My oncologist was enthusiastic about the clinical trial and thought it might be a good match for me, since women with the BRCA mutation have been shown to benefit from PARP inhibitors. He and I both got as far as signing the consent forms. Then, my HIPEC surgeon told me I couldn't do the PARP inhibitor trial because I was still being followed in the HIPEC trial. My surgeon was concerned that my participation in a new clinical trial would mess up his data. My oncologist said he talked to my surgeon, but as it turned out, my oncologist learned I was ineligible for the PARP trial because of a technicality, something to do with the timing of my last chemo treatment that was not clear to us earlier. A little less than a year after I finished my second line of chemo treatment, I had my second recurrence in April 2015. That event officially ended my participation in the HIPEC trial. However, I still see my surgeon for checkups. I would do the HIPEC trial again because I knew I had an excellent surgeon and trusted him whether or not I received the treatment being studied. I wasn't attached to the outcome of randomization because I knew I was still going to receive the standard of care with an excellent medical team. It was more important for me to work with my surgeon than to be in the HIPEC trial. With my second recurrence, I didn't have surgery. I had 6 rounds of a single-agent, frequent low-dose chemo with an angiogenesis inhibitor. I'm now in my 3rd remission. This time, I opened a case file with the National Cancer Institute to see if I would be eligible for any of their ovarian cancer immunotherapy trials. After sending my medical records and a blood sample, it was determined I was currently ineligible because I had no evaluable disease. This might sound strange since I was on chemo for recurrence, but the volume of disease was so small that it was not enough to be usable in an immunotherapy trial. However, I have a direct line to the nurse I worked with to set up my records there. And if I recur, I'll be calling her again. I've always researched clinical trials each time my status changes. What has helped me immeasurably is to be able to talk things out with other survivors, particularly via the SHARE helpline during decision making, because I can't make these types of decisions in a vacuum. I need to get multiple perspectives. It's a key part of my research. When I'm recurring, I have a list of clinical trials ready for discussion with my oncologist. When I move into remission, I have another list of clinical trials. I guess you might call me a clinical trial shopper. I think clinical trials are an important part of my treatment planning to manage recurrent ovarian cancer. I may not participate in most of the trials I discuss with my doctor, but those discussions play an important role in my planning and understanding what options I have and how to think about them strategically. Unfortunately, given the trajectory of my disease to date, I'm planning ahead for a potential recurrence, and I'd like to enter an immunotherapy clinical trial. To that end, I'm on a complete drug break to recover from chemo and build up my immune system. While I basically stumbled into the high-tech trial, I'm being very intentional about finding an immunotherapy trial that my oncologist and I think is a good fit. In the meantime, my daughter turns 11 years old tomorrow. In the past 6 months, I've been doing a lot of speaking on the topic of living with recurrent cancer and patient-doctor communication. And since I'm in remission for now, I'm going to permit myself to take a break from clinical trial research. And that's my story.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Our next speaker is Eliza Adams. Eliza was diagnosed in 2005 with stage 2 invasive breast cancer and experienced a metastatic breast cancer occurrence in May 2013. Eliza has participated in 5 clinical trials. Thank you for being with us today, Eliza.
Thanks very much, Annie. And I'm enjoying hearing everybody's story. As Annie mentioned, I've participated in 5 clinical trials. The first one was actually for my early stage diagnosis in 2005. I was diagnosed with hormone positive stage 2B breast cancer and ultimately went through a regime of chemotherapy and so I was asked to, during my early stage, I was asked to participate in my first clinical trial, which is an observational trial, meaning that there's no intervention involved. It was more just they wanted to follow me. And so during the chemotherapy that I got for the first 8 cycles, I actually had a number of core biopsies done and MRIs done because they wanted to see the impact of the chemo on my cancer. Ultimately, I still needed the mastectomy, but I think it was at a time when there still wasn't any determinative whether it was better to get chemo before or after surgery. And I didn't actually find the outcome of that trial because I was so happy to be done with my cancer back in 2005 that I moved on from there. And then in 2013, I was diagnosed with advanced stage breast cancer to my bones, still hormone positive, HER2 negative, and at the outset, and I happen to be privileged to live in an area where there are many cancer research hospitals, and I'm being treated at a cancer research hospital. So I think my story, as you will tell, is really reflects that, and I'm when I originally chose my treatment center, I very much wanted to go to a place that had a pretty deep bench strength, and I was lucky enough to be able to do that. So when I was diagnosed with the metastatic disease, my doctor at the outset asked if I would be willing to participate in a clinical trial. And you may remember Annie talking about the 3 different phases of clinical trials, and coincidentally, my story involves all 3 going in reverse order. So it might help to understand in that trial, I was the standard of care, which is the drug I would have got regardless of whether or not I participated, was Faslodex. It's a hormone therapy drug, and so the extra drug it still has a number as far as I know, so it's not even yet been approved, although it is it's a therapy that blocks a protein called PI3K, which appear to help cancer cells increase their resistance to hormone therapy. And I had clearly shown resistance to hormone therapy because although I had been on hormonal drugs ever since my early stage, I ultimately developed metastatic. So this was a trial. It was a double-blind, randomized test trial, and so it was uncertain whether or not I would be getting the numbered drug, but I was definitely getting the Faslodex. I stayed on that trial for 8 months, getting about 6 months into it. There was clearly a slowdown in progression, but by the 6th month, it appeared like there was probably some progression. By the 8th month, it had been confirmed that my cancer had progressed to my liver. And so at that time, I was withdrawn from that clinical trial. I think, and Annie alluded to this, I think I probably was not receiving the drug that was the experimental drug, simply because my side effects didn't seem to appear to have any of the indicators that I might have had. But I've since tried to find out whether or not I was in the experimental drug or the placebo, and have not yet been able to find out. And what I've been told is that if I ever need to know for future clinical trial, I will be able to find out. But even to this day, my doctor does not know. So you don't always get to know, even when you think you should know. But I had a great experience with it. I think for me, I always get a lot of attention. I think both of the previous speakers alluded to that, particularly Jane, I got a lot of attention. The intervention for me in that first clinical trial in terms of the amount of time was not tremendous. I did have to go back more frequently and probably for longer stages early on, but that was an oral drug. So I had to go back once a month for the Faslodex anyway. I got the oral drug, and by the 2nd or 3rd month, it was pretty pain-free in terms of the treatment. My next clinical trial actually happened. It was also an observational trial, no intervention, and it was a trial where they were trying to, again, they're looking at, it was to get genetic materials, and it was an opportunity to have my tumor have a genomic biopsy and get all of the genetic information through a clinical trial. So I didn't actually need to pay for that information, and so I said yes to that clinical trial without any question, and they are probably using the materials from the biopsy and as well as the genetic information for all sorts of research that I won't find out about, but an outcome of that was that I do know where I have mutations in my tumors, which is really useful information when looking at clinical trials. After I advanced on that placebo or that experimental trial, I was on a series of hormone drugs until early this year. I was asked whether or not I wanted to participate in another clinical trial. I continued to advance. My cancer did not respond to any of those hormone drugs during that period. So I went on to a drug which is a sister drug to something called palbociclib or Ibrance, which I think many in the breast cancer world are very familiar with because Ibrance is shown to be very, very effective, and in fact was taken out of phase 2 trials early and approved and has shown to be effective. The drug I was on was made by another drug manufacturer, but had a very similar effect on me. Again, and it was an oral drug also. At the beginning of a clinical trial, there's always a lot of time you have to spend, but once I got up and running after the first couple of months, I would say, it was again kind of go in monthly for, I do get other treatment alongside the cancer, alongside this cancer treatment, so I always have to go in monthly anyway. And it was a very effective drug for me. My biggest side effect was diarrhea. So, but I managed that through my diet and was very lucky to have a pretty, I'm sorry, I'm not following the slides very well. I was very lucky to have pretty minimal side effects. The other thing that happened, which also happens with the Palbo, is that my something called ANC, or absolute neutrophil count, which is basically the white blood cell count, was very, very low. So I would often get a booster just to get the drug, but it was worth it to me to be on a drug that was so effective. I had had a lot of bone pain, and during that period, the bone pain went away. So I was sad, but when about a month ago, or a little over a month ago, I learned that the cancer had progressed further in my liver, even on this trial, but really thrilled with the fact that I had kept it at bay for 8 months. I thought that was great, and was almost going to go on to a chemo, and then at the last minute, I think through the research nurse that I had been working with on the prior clinical trial, where they found a spot open in an immunotherapy trial that they thought I would be effective for. And so, I say it's my doctor that recommends it. I actually think a lot of times the research nurses and the researchers are very, very intimately involved, and I had developed a good relationship with her. And so she called me actually a couple of days before I was supposed to start chemo and said, I've found this trial, I've talked about it with your doctor, and we think it's a good trial for you. And so this trial is probably going to require a little bit more time than the other ones I've been on. I started yesterday. I had my first infusion, and although I spent 11 hours at the cancer center, I did come away well rested, and I'm feeling pretty good today, and I'm very optimistic about it, and feel very lucky to be able to participate in these trials. I think I say, I do it, yes, I think as Annie said, I do it for myself, clearly. I also do it because I want to support the research. I want to diversify my own treatment options, which is really because I think we who are in the metastatic setting know that we're going to be treated for the rest of our lives for this disease. And the more treatment options there are, the better off we are. So the more I give myself. And yes, delaying standard chemo because it restricts the trials is also another reason. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Eliza.
Our next speaker, Karen Durham, was unable at the last moment to be able to join us live, but we were able to record a message from Karen. Karen's living with metastatic breast cancer, has participated in several clinical trials, and was an exceptional responder. Here's Karen's story.
Texas. I was originally diagnosed with stage 2 invasive breast cancer in 1989 at the age of 38. I completed all of my surgeries, my chemotherapy, and reconstruction, and I was really considered cancer-free until I was diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic disease in January of 2009. At that time, my oncologist recommended that I consider participating in a clinical trial, and the research department at the Cancer Center found me a trial. At that time, I didn't know very much about clinical trials at all, but I was game to try it. After extensive testing, in March 2009, I began a randomized phase 2 clinical trial consisting of a drug with FDA approval for treating leukemia plus an aromatase inhibitor. The study was not blinded, only randomized, so I knew from the start that I was receiving both drugs on this trial. It seemed to take forever to get the drug dosage regulated to an amount that I could safely tolerate. Prior to finding the safe dosage, I continually had fluid buildup, especially in the lungs and around the heart. Some weeks I was at the cancer center 3 to 4 times a week. Then after I got my dosage finally regulated, the other side effects gradually lessened and leveled off, but they were all still there. At this point, the side effects I were experiencing were very manageable and tolerable. They were listed in my consent form, and none of them were unexpected. Way back in 1989, 1990, when I had traditional chemotherapy, there were very few drugs to counteract the side effects, and the chemotherapy was not well tolerated or managed. Remember, this was prior to the days of anti-nausea medications. Beginning in 2009, I was scanned with either a CT scan or a PET CT scan every 8 weeks for the first 3 years. Then the scan frequency extended to every 12 weeks. I thought, what a relief this is. Appointments with my oncologist were still every 4 weeks. In December 2013, I was very fortunate to be sitting in the audience, and I heard firsthand the results of the clinical trial when it was presented at SABCS in San Antonio. The trial was officially over at that time, and based on the response rate, the drug that I was on was not going to be pursued as a metastatic breast cancer treatment drug. I was the only long-term responder. That was an extremely stressful time, since I did not think that drug would be available to me unless I was on the trial. I can't express my relief when I was officially notified 4 months later that I would continue to receive both of these drugs, one free of charge from the pharmaceutical company, and the other was completely covered by my health insurance, for as long as I continued to respond to them. And also at that time, it was determined that I could extend my oncology visit to every week, yippee, and the scan frequency to every 4 to 6 months, depending on my oncologist's recommendations. Even though I knew up front when I started this trial that I would be seeing my oncologist at least every 28 days and scanned every 8 weeks, which eventually extended out to every 12 weeks, I didn't fully realize the impact of how many trips to the cancer center that would actually be. I don't think anyone could actually understand it until they experience it. Then in January 2015, unfortunately, I did experience disease progression. This was after almost 6 years as a metastatic patient on those same 2 original drugs. After more extensive testing, a 30-day washout period to flush those 2 drugs out of my system, I began my second clinical trial in March of this year, 2015. The same routine started all over again. The difference in this second clinical trial and the first one is that this one was double-blinded, randomized, but still a phase 2 study. The double-blinded meant my physician did not even know whether I was receiving both drugs or not. I personally do not like the double-blinded part. I feel that every patient has a right to know whether they're receiving the trial drug or not, or just receiving the standard of care. I would have still taken part in the trial, but I wanted to know. Another reason is it's very difficult to go to any other physician and tell them you don't know what drugs you're taking. Then, when you do progress, it's such a letdown when you thought for all that time that you were on both drugs, then you find out you're not. Just one more roller coaster that a metastatic person has to deal with. However, at that point, I did have the reassurance of knowing that I was receiving at least the standard of care. After 6 months, I once again had disease progression. At that time, I was unblinded on the clinical trial and found to only be receiving the standard of care drug, not the trial drug. I was immediately transferred over to the other and began receiving both drugs. The side effects of this combination of the two drugs is harsher than it was before, but it is still much, much milder compared to 1990, and it is very tolerable. I would personally encourage others to participate in a clinical trial. If your oncologist does not recommend one, you can certainly do your own research. There are several websites out there to look for them, and then ask your oncologist about it. This is where our new, more effective treatment drugs come from, the only way that we're able to get new treatments for metastatic patients. Thank you.
So thank you to all the panelists. We have a couple of questions, and if you have any additional questions, please submit them now. So the first question is, are patients made aware of the outcome of their clinical trial? Annie or Eliza?
Yeah, my understanding is that there is no mechanism in place right now that requires an investigator to notify patients of the results of a clinical trial. Some clinical trial results are supposed to be on the ClincalTrials.gov website, but there is not a lot of, that's not always followed 100%. If you do go to ClincalTrials.gov, you can, there should be a tab for trial results, but again, not every trial is going to be on there, and it's for completed trials. So if a trial is discontinued early, we may never know why, and there are some regulatory things where there are gaps, you know, and it is a frustrating thing for patients. If you do have the contact information, you can always go back to the investigator and the research team and ask questions and get copies. I know that for my phase 1 immunotherapy trial, it was presented at ASCO a couple of years ago, and so I was able to access the data and figure out who I was, which is kind of a cool thing, but there's no guarantee that we're ever going to know what the result of our participation is.
Thank you. So another question. It's from a listener. I have a small amount of recurrent fallopian tube ovarian cancer, 5 or 6 months post-successful surgery and chemo. Although my CA-125 is never totally normalized, there were contributing factors to this. Can I get help from a research nurse in seeking a suitable clinical trial, since both hospitals I've consulted with do not seem to have the trial I need? I'd like to consider a trial sooner rather than later. Is a research nurse a way to go, or?
Sure. This is Savannah Shine. Excuse my voice. I have a cold. But we just added some functionality to our website, which is a clinical trial matching service, and it's partnered. Annie mentioned it earlier with Emerging Med. There is a case management component to this. If you would like to log on to our website, there's also a phone number if you prefer just directly to call the partnership. You can, here, thank you, Annie. It's, I cannot read it. It's 1-877-769-4932. So that, you can also log on to our website. There's a case management component where somebody will be assigned to you directly, and that person can help you determine through the navigation service what specific clinical trials will be effective for you, or where you can apply, and they can help you specifically connect. So that, I don't know whether that person is trained as a nurse, but that would certainly be some more individual attention that you'd be able to get using that service.
Thank you, Savannah. My breast cancer metastasized to my stomach, which is not possible to measure via scans. It can be biopsied via an endoscopy. I've been told by an oncologist that I would never be eligible for a trial because it's not measurable. Is this true?
We're not medical professionals, so we're not in a position to answer that. You could, contact the Emerging Med Clinical Trial Matching Service through SHARE, and somebody could try to walk you through it to see if there are any trials that you are eligible for.
Okay, we have time for one last question. I have stage 3C ovarian cancer, and my oncologist just offered a phase 1 trial to me that I really cannot find any information on. I've never done a trial before, and the lack of information is very scary to me.
Phase 1 trials can be first in human. They're if you're not finding any information anywhere, it's possible that it just hasn't been done in humans yet. Sometimes with a phase 1, they change the formula a little bit, or they add a little something to it, so there may be data out there. It's really important that we weigh our risks and we weigh what the potential benefits are and really come to a comfort level. I do know one stage 4 ovarian cancer survivor who had pulmonary edema from diagnosis who participated in I'm thinking it was like 13 clinical trials, and most of them were phase 1s. Some of them were for limited amounts of time. She had developed a relationship with the phase 1 research coordinator at her institution. She was out on the West Coast, and was able to, get in that way and learn about what was going on and have a little bit more information about the drug than maybe some of us who have to use the internet and other sources do. So. And I participated in phase 1, but I was really comfortable because, again, the formula was changed from something that I had already heard about. So it's all a basic needing your doctor to be able to explain things to you and help you come to a comfort level. If you do not come to a comfort level, then perhaps you shouldn't participate. My belief is that people with metastatic and recurrent disease can benefit and expand their options by considering clinical trials at every decision point. But not every clinical trial is right for everybody, and that's why we need to talk about it and find out information and become our own advocates and just learn as much as we can.
So for more information about clinical trials, you can visit SHARE's website, Savannah mentioned, and check out the clinical trial matching service provided by Emerging Med. And you can also check out ClincalTrials.gov and visit the metastatic trial search feature that's now available on that site. So I'd like to thank Annie for taking this idea and running with it, and for creating this informative program and helping to recruit panelists. And I'd really like to thank the panelists for their participation, for sharing their stories. Eliza, Jane, Jessica, and Karen, thank you so much. And thank you all for participating. Please take a moment to fill out the survey at the end of the webinar. One last message.
Yeah, these slides will be available on SHARE's website within the next few days. If you have not had a chance to write down all these resources, we also have a list of questions to ask from ClincalTrials.gov, which may be helpful for people who are considering whether or not to participate in a clinical trial. And just to leave you with our final thoughts, clinical trials are a way to find out if the new therapies are safe and effective and better than or equal to the current standard of care. We can use clinical trials to expand our treatment options. People who have had fewer lines of chemotherapy can qualify for more clinical trials. And again, not every clinical trial is right for every person. So be your own advocate and do your own due diligence. Thank you.